Today I want to talk about the similarities between the fall of the Roman Republic and the possible fall of the American Republic. Now, obviously, America has not fallen and is not necessarily super close to falling at this point, but I think with the recent turmoil and just kind of the division within America right now, we're beginning to see more and more of that talk of like when a civilization kind of starts to hit its end point. And a lot of times it's pretty easy to tie back to Rome. But actually, I think in this case, there are some very direct parallels that I find very interesting. So it's going to start in a moment here with events, and then I'm going to compare specific characters within Roman history and American history. Think Reagan, Trump, JFK, all those people I have direct parallels to from the Roman world. And while I'm not going to tell you whether or not we are going to fall or if I think personally that we're very similar, I think by the end of the video you'll have enough information to draw your own conclusion about what could be happening in America. If you pick up a history book today about the fall of the Roman Republic, the first thing it's going to mention is the Punic Wars. And the reason that they're going to do that is because that is where Rome defeats Carthage. Over 3 wars in this grandiose, really spectacular event in history, I suggest anybody reads about it, Rome kind of defeats their biggest adversary. And afterwards, the Western and really all of the Mediterranean kind of just belongs to Rome. And because of that, immense wealth and resources are going to start flowing into Rome. And it's going to inherently change Rome. Punic Wars happened in the 3rd century BC, which is a couple hundred years before the Roman Republic was actually bound to fall. During the victory over Carthage and the subsequent ones over all of the kingdoms in the eastern Mediterranean, Rome was to gain an immense level of wealth and prestige, more so than it had ever experienced before. What that means is that the scale was much greater. Before, when a commander or consul was selected, they would go out, defeat a marauding army, come back, maybe celebrate a triumph if it was a big victory. But now, when marauding generals returned, came back absolutely loaded. And these guys ended up starting to abuse some of that power. And not only booty, more importantly, slaves. Millions of slaves. And you have to understand this from a general's or an army's perspective. When you see something like this army sacked a city in this year, what the sacking of a city really looked like wasn't just taking gold trinkets. Most people didn't have fucking gold trinkets. It was taking people. That was the carryable wealth. Maybe there was some treasure in that town, but the movable wealth was the slaves itself. And the Romans actually had a very systematized way of doing this. Each legionary would receive an equal number of slaves to return home and sell. Over the next few centuries in the Italian peninsula, things really started to change pretty quickly. The average citizen farmer was beginning to be slowly priced out by these huge lafundia, is what they called them in Latin. And what those were basically these huge senatorial estates. Slowly, they had gobbled up the little guy, essentially. You can kind of start to see some comparisons here. The Italian peninsula was carved up just into these huge, huge elite estates. And slowly, the urban poor would funnel into Rome and other urban centers in the area. What this effectively meant is that there was a huge discontented population living within Rome itself and all around the Italian peninsula. Agriculture was the economy. The Romans didn't have a dynamic economy like we might imagine an economy is today. It was all really based on food and land. And especially the senatorial elite, they actually weren't allowed to participate in everyday commercial business because it was seen as beneath them. Over this same period of time, the Roman elite themselves were very ambitious. Roman elite culture was heavily centered around ambition and success. In the house of every elite family in the city, there was a hall filled with wax heads of their ancestors that said everything that they had achieved, which is kind of a mindfuck when you think about it. If you had in your house a wax figure of your descendants and everything they achieved that you now must achieve, and if you don't, you'll be a failure and might not even get your head along with them. It would just, I don't know, that'd be something. You can kind of see once it loses its biggest adversary, like Carthage, it's going to begin to turn inwards. Now let's go to America. There's a few different options for America's Punic War equivalent, although the most obvious one is the World Wars. In 1914, the US and Argentina had the same GDP, which is really wild to think about when you look at the numbers today. A huge reason that is the effects of World War I and World War II on Europe, and capital flowing to the U.S. afterwards. A lot of Americans don't really fully appreciate this, but we weren't on top of the world prior to World War II. It was after World War II, along with, can't remember what that bill's called, but the bill that rebuilt Europe and kind of entrenched America and effectively USD into the world economic system. Those changes are what really caused the long-term benefits. Besides World War I and II, I think of the Cold War. I think it's a little bit too recent to be an exact parallel to what we're talking about with the Romans, but again, it's kind of the two world superpowers at the time, the US and the Soviet Union, going at each other, and eventually the Soviet Union crumbling. Not due to military, but you kind of get the idea. What we see after World War II in America is kind of the beginning of capital just completely taking over. I think from the beginning, the idea that the power is with the people in America has kind of been a farce. I mean, certainly, I don't think our votes are disappearing, but I also think that the optics, the candidates, the campaigning, I don't think that we have much choice in it. I think even the primary, when you think about it, we don't really come up with the candidates. What comes to mind for me as a young American is 2016, where Bernie Sanders had won and the DNC selected Hillary Clinton in his place. I don't think it's crazy to say that the people aren't represented in the current government. The reason I think that is because, you kind of have that initial industrial revolution capital takeover where guys like Carnegie, Rockefeller, JP Morgan, they kind of all build these monopolies surrounding the dominant industries at the time. And then we have a trust-busting era, which I would argue is the last time that the U.S. really tried. And I don't know too much about the politics of the time, but I do know that trusts or monopolies were broken up, specifically by Taft. And afterwards, we never see that kind of effort again. So to tie that into what I'm actually saying is, this is when capital starts to dominate everything. Over the 50s, 60s, and 70s, America grew at an exponential rate. The labor market was fantastic. It was needed everywhere, which incentivized the capitalists to work with the Labor Party because they needed skilled workers, which they did for about 30 years, I'd say, after World War II. The American worker was incentivized and was a powerful force in American economics. Which brings us to the first person-to-person comparison, which would be JFK and Tiberius/Gaius Gracchus. There's a term that's used in the Roman Republic that I find really interesting, which is mos maiorum, which I don't know the exact Latin translation, but it essentially means breaking the standard. And when I say breaking the standard, I mean there's certain cultural norms that are in place, and by breaking them, you show that they can be broken. And that's exactly what the Gracchi brothers would do. The Gracchis were patricians, which were the elite leading class in Rome. The Gracchi family themselves were a very old aristocratic line. Tiberius Gracchus was the older brother, and what he was going to do is he's going to break rank with the senatorial class. And he's going to do that by looking towards the populace for power. In the past, the oligarchy had kind of held in all the power. You got to understand the mindset of an ancient person would be that these patricians and these elite people were truly chosen by God, and that they were different inherently than the plebeians that were looking up to them. So to see them kind of break rank would mean more than it means now. But in any case, Tiberius Gracchus looked to the people and turned to populism, which populism was very much frowned upon in the senatorial class. He did this by trying to push through land reforms because he saw the inherent damage that had been done to the Republic by the Lafundia that were kind of gobbling up all of the single-family farms. Come on. So Tiberius Gracchus, he did end up building a power base for himself, but he was a little bit too early. Populism would eventually get very popular, but he was a little bit early and was clubbed to death, actually, which I find it's an easy parallel to JFK, because obviously JFK was also an aristocrat. He was also a populist to some extent. He was kind of the first president that was able to take advantage of the TV and being broadcast all over the country. And he was very charismatic. He was also very outspoken and seemed genuinely interested in supporting the working class and supporting the everyday person. I think anybody can say whatever they want. I think it's hard to really glean what JFK actually might have thought to himself at night about the people or what he was doing, but I think his assassination is very indicative of what he wanted to accomplish. I think Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone. Call me crazy, but it's not really the point of this video. The point is, someone broke rank and was killed for it by their own class. Tiberius Gracchus happened to have a little brother named Gaius Gracchus who tried to do a very similar thing because Tiberius Gracchus's reforms were kind of canceled after he was killed. Gaius Gracchus was also killed. So both dead. The original populists, or as the patricians would say, demagogues, were dead. I've just got to add this part because it's the freest parallel of all time, but Gaius Gracchus and Robert Kennedy, the little brother, tries to carry on the torch and gets killed along with his older brother, kind of running on the same platform. I mean, just another obvious parallel. Both killed for breaking rank and running on the wrong platforms, and just to kind of set a precedent of, like, if you tried to do this, it's just not in the playbook. You're going to be killed. Now, this parallel is a little bit rougher than the previous ones, but I think Marius and Ronald Reagan are similar in a lot of ways. Not in their personality, really, or their politics, but more so in the sense that they set up the eventual success of, on Marius's hand, martial law, and on Ronald Reagan's hand, kind of like the dictatorship of capital. Marius, in some senses, saved Rome, which Ronald Reagan did not do. All right, let me explain some things first. Marius saved Rome from the Gauls. He was consul 7 times, but one of his biggest legacies, actually probably definitely his biggest legacy, is the professional army he left behind. He inherited this system where the Romans had the hastati, the princeps, and the triarii, all based on their experience. They were all, or mostly, citizen farmers from the Italian peninsula itself. It kind of lended itself to a high morale army. They're defending their homeland. They are all intrinsically tied to the general and the state, and this connection is the reason that they fight. Marius is going to get rid of the land requirement. So now soldiers can join the army from the urban poor. And the urban poor and the average citizen farmer are incredibly different in their values and what they actually desire. The urban poor are rather disenchanted with the state. They are upset, and frankly, if you're a poor person in ancient Rome, in the city of Rome itself, life kind of fucking blows. I mean, very similar to the modern day. You're living in a small apartment. It's super muggy in Rome. It's super dirty. It's not a city that's set up very well, actually. So you're kind of disenchanted with the state. And then you go out into the country. You win military victories, which I can't even imagine how fucking hyped that would be. And then you win a military victory, and this general gives you something. No one's really given you stuff before, and he gives you wealth, and he gives you promises that in the future you're going to get more. You're going to get land, you're going to get a farm, you're going to get this big payment at the end of your career as long as you serve with him for a certain amount of time. Now, whether or not you care much about your retirement plan at the time, you look to this general like he is something that's not even human. So in this way, Marius set up what would eventually become kind of like a cult of personality as these generals. And this would almost directly actually lead to the end of the Roman Republic, when these generals had just an overwhelming amount of support. Now, the way that I would tie Marius to Ronald Reagan is to say that I think in the way that Marius set the tone for the military, Ronald Reagan set the tone for capital. He did it by destroying union labor, most famously with TSA when he fired tens of thousands of employees of the government for wanting fairer wages. He did it by changing the corporate tax structure so that less money was coming in from the top of society, which he claimed would lead to trickle-down economics, which at the time was mathematically disprovable, and 50 years later is definitely disprovable. He also moved us off of the gold standard, which I don't know the most about, honestly, but most people I talk to really dislike that change. You can kind of see the loose parallel of these guys kind of set up future generations for the conditions that they would have. In Rome, this would lead very quickly to Sulla. Sulla was kind of the next generation after Marius. They lived simultaneously, obviously. Marius resented Sulla. He was a young man, very charismatic, and very quickly started winning military victories in the East. Sulla was the successor to Marius in a way. He was very clearly going to become like the next guy in Rome. I'd say this next parallel could cause some people to comment, but I'm going to compare, I think Sulla and Donald J. Trump are similar in some ways. Sulla's a really interesting figure. I'll tell you about his personality. I'm not saying that it's a direct correlation to Donald Trump. I think Sulla's a much more genuine figure than Donald Trump in a lot of senses. But Sulla in his youth was a partier. He drank all the time, hung out with the lowest of society, like actors, musicians, gladiators, you know, what the elite Romans at the time would say are slaves, literally. They are slaves. He even continued a romantic relationship with a musician, or maybe an actor, can't remember. But anyway, it was very frowned upon, and he kind of like touted her around, and it was the elite Romans at the time were very frustrated by it. Which I think the more I say it out loud, there are some similarities to Trump in some ways. It's hard for me because I find Sulla's like really interesting, whereas Trump's I find like gross. So I don't want him. Feels like disrespectful to this ancient mass murderer to compare him to Trump. But yeah, I don't know. But you can see how Trump also he broke cultural norms that an American aristocrat would do. You know, he's on reality TV shows. He's always been he doesn't act just like a businessman. You know, there's kind of like there's a personality behind it, and there's an image trying to be projected behind it that I think parallels could be drawn to Sulla, because I think they're both interesting figures. I think it's hard to view Donald Trump in that lens right now because he's still alive and he's still currently the president. But I think as someone that truly likes history, if I was studying this 100 years in the future, Donald Trump would be a very interesting figure as kind of like the more overarching things about him come out, and all these minute day-to-day things that I really dislike aren't really a part of the character that's portrayed in history. But he is alive right now, so. Sulla would eventually go east to command an army. He would do very well. He would lavish rewards. As I was saying earlier, he's kind of a people's people. He connects really well with the urban poor because he also, while coming from an elite family, his family had fallen on hard times, and he did live amongst that when he was a child. I believe his father died very young, and the family fortune was kind of mishandled. Honestly, similar to Trump as well, now that I'm saying it out loud. Not that I don't think the fortune was mishandled, but his dad died kind of young. So yeah, then Sulla had this cult of personality. The troops followed him. He would march back to Rome after Marius slaughtered a lot of his followers. And he'd do something interesting, which I think is the biggest parallel to Trump, is he would break the Pomeranian. And I don't know if it's Pomeranian's a dog. It might be Pomerium or something. It's Latin for this line that surrounded the city that you weren't allowed to pass through under arms. Now, Sulla was under arms, and for the however long, 500 years, the Roman Republic had been a thing. No one's passed through that under arms. And the Romans are highly religious people. Things like norms mean something to them that they don't mean to us, and it's harder for us to understand. But they would think that breaking a norm like this would cause, revenge from the gods or some kind of huge misfortune by disobeying the gods in this way. But he did cross the Pomeranian with an army, and he did kill a lot of people in the city. He did something called the prescriptions, where he would put up, a banner with however many names on it, and those people had lost all their rights in the state and were killed. So a lot of his enemies, a lot of him just trying to get some money at the time. A lot of people that probably genuinely did deserve it, a lot of people that didn't, because it ended up being thousands of people were killed over that however long period of time. Now, another thing that I think is easy to draw a parallel with is that Sulla did this under the guise of restoring the Roman Republic, which, make America great again, restore the Roman Republic, come on guys, make me feed it to you. So he made himself a dictator, which in the past was a term that lasted 6 months, and it was only under extreme circumstances, but Sulla at the time, he made himself dictator indefinitely, essentially, which was completely unprecedented and led to a ton of people being very upset with him. But you got to keep in mind, he's got this army outside that is full of veterans that support him and like him, and what are you going to do? I mean, at the time, a sword was really all that mattered. What are your coins going to do? What is your farm going to do out there if there's 10,000 experienced soldiers outside the gates? There's nothing you can do. And after the prescriptions, a lot of his main enemies were dead, and it was kind of like, well, what do you do? So during that time, he'd completely restructure the government, restructure terms, restructure like how many of each post were available at a time. He would massively increase the amount of magistrates and restructure how long a person could be in control of an army to try to actually avoid what he had done. Now with Sulla kind of at the end of his reforming, let's go back to Trump here. I'd say Trump did break Mas Maiorum in a lot of different ways so far in his term. I don't want it to seem very political because that kind of like, I'm talking about Roman history here. I don't want to have to look at the comments and be like, oh, but what about this? What about this? It's not. Don't worry about it. Trump has broken Mas Maiorum, certainly. I think he started after the 2020 election with his speech about how it had been stolen. And no matter how you feel about what happened on January 6th, like that's a huge parallel to what I'm talking about. That breaks so much tradition for him to stand up there and give a speech about how it was stolen and on what they should do, which the suggestion was to go march on the Capitol to stop the ratifying of the election. That's like 100% what he said. Talk with a wall. That's just what happened. Obviously, he ended up sucking it up, real big of him, and spending the next 4 years complaining until he was elected again, which that kind of, since the 2024 election, I'd say that he really just doesn't really care anymore because he's probably going to die pretty soon, and this is his second term. I think he's broken our cultural norms in a lot of different ways, in the sense that he's just participating in corruption on a very large and open scale. Just to cite a few examples is initially he dropped a meme coin when he was elected president. That was one of the first things he did, really. And you guys may or may not know this, but the Trump family literally made billions of dollars on that meme coin. No matter what he says, he can try to ignore it, but that was, it's so hard to imagine another president doing something like that. like if Obama or Biden dropped a meme coin, just the pure outrage and disgrace that would bring to our country. So in a sense, that's breaking mas maiorum. And from a historian, I would encourage you guys to try to look at it from a historical perspective, because it's much more interesting and less sad from a historical perspective, because figures like Trump are always surrounding power. We just happen to be witnessing one right now that's very, very entertaining, I'd say. If you're able to look at it from the outside and not be like really upset that America's gonna have to fall. So maybe it's not very entertaining, but I'd say another way that he's broken mas maiorum is just the direct ties to the Middle East. Not even just talking about Israel and stuff, but his ties to these huge oil conglomerates, Qatar, or Qatar, however you want to say it. They gave him a $350 million jet. He's received a lot of money from the Middle East. I'd say another way he's broken it is by putting his family everywhere and kind of entrenching them in this as well. His son is an advisor for Kalshi and Poly Market, while Kalshi and Poly Market states have been fighting against them that don't have gambling in them, and the Fed is ignoring them and kind of like letting it happen. Jared Kushner, married to his daughter Ivanka, he is the representative in the Middle East and also has ties to a ton of different Saudi companies. It's all just kind of tied together, and you know the things are happening so quickly that it's hard to even focus on one event that's happening, let alone the files, which breaks mas maiorum in so many different ways. But this video is not about Donald Trump. Those are just the ways that he's kind of like breaking what we would imagine is like the norm, and what a president of what was once a prestigious country would do and how they'd represent us. And it kind of opens the door, which is exactly what Sulla did, to the future generations breaking it down even further. Trump might even do kind of what Sulla did, in this ballroom he's building is kind of built like a military-style bunker, and he's very openly talked about running again in 2028, which I think he almost certainly will try to do. And to me, I mean, that's a perfect parallel to Sulla kind of taking this supreme command and way overextending the term and using that power to kind of entrench himself and his followers. I will say Sulla had more of, like, he actually does seem to have wanted the Republic to return to what it was. He wanted to make it so no one could achieve what he achieved again, which kind of worked for like a small period of time, but not really, because, again, he had broken the norm. And once you break the norm, the broken norm becomes the norm. So then it just opens the door for dominoes to fall, which is what could happen in the U.S. I'd also compare them in the sense that Sulla was able to do this with a relatively small amount of supporters and people, because they were so entrenched with what he was doing. They were willing to march on Rome for him, which, again, is a very direct parallel to kind of the MAGA movement. And again, I'm not trying to insult anybody that may have been a part of that or is a part of that right now, but this kind of like just overarching support for Donald Trump without really thinking about it, that is more of it's basically just made it so Trump's approval ratings is in the 30s. I think it's like 34% or something. So with a relatively small contingent of the population, he's able to still dominate the culture in a sense, which is a very direct parallel to Sulla. And I think it's perfect to compare them because obviously the American Republic hasn't fallen. I don't really know what it would take for it to technically fall, but Sulla, afterwards, the Republic did not fall. It took another like 80 years or something. So if we are going to continue to compare them, where does that go then? To look at the Roman Republic, what's going to happen is eventually big figures are going to come. Big figures, it's going to start with Pompey, which Pompey is again going to directly come after Sulla. It went Marius, Sulla, Pompey in a row, basically, where Sulla's kind of there's actually, famously, they called Sulla the setting sun and Pompey the rising sun. So Pompey would go to the east and win even greater victories, come back with even greater wealth, lavished it on the troops. Interestingly, Pompey does appear to have cared about the Republic and wanted it to continue. He really just wanted to receive praise. It doesn't seem like he wanted ultimate power necessarily, which is more a result of his personality rather than the times. Because what we're going to see is, at the same time as Pompey, about 10 years his junior, is going to be a man named Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar is going to take advantage of all of the cultural norms that have been broken. He's going to take advantage of all the military changes, and he's going to put it all into one charismatic figure. And that one charismatic figure, over the period of about 15 years, after combining with Pompey and then breaking off with him and then marching on Rome and then defeating Pompey and the Republic, he is going to supplant the Republic by making himself dictator. He's going to die, he's going to be killed, and his great-nephew Octavius is going to receive his will and, in a pretty spectacular string of events, become the emperor himself. Now, the way that we could see that playing out in the U.S. could be replace the generals with these CEOs. That's kind of, I think, the parallel, because not all the cult of generals are going to march on Rome and try to destroy it. And really, Caesar, it doesn't even appear that that was really what he wanted to do. It was more that he was going to be prosecuted, and basically the options for him was give up his political career or march on Rome and really destroy the Republic. And he happened to be a man that was of the ambition that he couldn't stand to be knocked down like that, especially if he knew he could take it over. I don't think it's unrealistic to think in the next 50 years some of these CEOs that have gone unchecked for decades could be at a point of power where they supersede the state. Not that they make more money necessarily, but they make enough money to completely buy out the state, buy all the means of resources, completely horizontally integrate into the economy and infrastructure to the point where they're almost just another nation. And at that point, the people have no power at all. And then it doesn't really matter. And it already doesn't matter. That's the thing. And at the time, it didn't either. And another thing that's hard for the people is now we're under so much more scrutiny and surveillance than a Roman ever was. I don't think Lucius, who was walking to get his bread in the morning, had to worry about like a flock camera or a drone or some kind of digital ID. I think he just got his bread and went home. And I think that it's a lot more confusing now as to what we would do as the people. But interestingly, in the fall of the Roman Republic, it also didn't really matter what the people thought or did. These populists and demagogues preached to them and were able to gain their support, but it was kind of just these big figures that made the difference. The people and what they wanted, it didn't really matter that much. Eventually, Julius Caesar is going to co-opt a lot of the population and a group of legionaries, but it wasn't like he controlled the means of production and all the labor, and then he was able to do this, because it just didn't matter. It doesn't matter. And even if, in the past, revolutions have happened where the people are the ones that revolt, but it doesn't always happen that way. And some of the times it's just these powerful factions clashing with each other, and one of them wins. And now that power is so concentrated and confusing, it kind of might play out like that again, especially because the everyday person is just they're so distracted, and it's hard for me to blame like every individual person for not being like fully aware and willing to act on like the information that we have. Like, a lot of people just have kids to take care of, and they're going to work every day, and they don't have time to come home and further research what might be going on in the U.S. and how we can change it, and just what, I don't know, I wish it wasn't the responsibility of the everyday person to do everything in their normal lives, which has never been more hard or confusing, and then also have a really concrete opinion on what needs to happen in the government and what we can do. And then if you don't get that, being an activist and changing that, I think it's a lot of responsibility for a person to have. And while in a perfect world, yes, that would be the case, it's not the case. And throughout history, it's never been the case. The everyday person has never been a big part of power and politics. And even democracy itself it's not, I'd say on this large of a scale, it's not real. We saw it in this election of Kentucky's 4th District between Thomas Massey and Ed Gallerine, I think his name was, Ed Dipshit. He didn't show up to any of his debates. He didn't do anything. Thomas Massey's the incumbent. He comes in, he gets outspent. It's that simple. There's less money involved. He got beat. And I'll tell you guys, as long as cable ads can convince people, what are we going to do? So part of that is nihilism, and part of that is just realism of it's okay to just observe sometimes and to not feel so hard on yourself to change everything all at once. Just be educated and protect what's important to you, and try to focus on the micro sometimes and not let the macro destroy your mindset. And the reason I'm saying all this, it doesn't really pertain to the video, but I'm kind of saying this because it feels like we're in that period between Sulla and Julius Caesar right now. Like if Sulla is Trump, then that means that we have a certain amount of time before we get to Caesar. And just so you guys know, every civilization before this has collapsed as well. This is the movement of time and people, and it's probably going to continue to happen for a long time. And it doesn't always have to be terrible and horrific. What I hope it's not is, kind of got derailed a little bit, but these huge generals, like I was saying, are just CEOs. In this case, tech CEOs. Like, to me, a figure like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Zuckerberg, on any of the Mag 7 guys, and some other more discreet, powerful billionaires, those are the generals now, because it's no longer about troops, it's about capital, and it's about power and resources, because the troop part doesn't really matter anymore. So the more that these guys control and continue to control, and also go to the state and the Romans' perspective, increase their proconsulship, increase their amount of time they're in control of the armies. These rich guys go in, and the American equivalent is tax breaks and subsidies and all these different things. So those are all the comparisons. Obviously, not a super in-depth video about all the specific ones, but I think it was interesting. It's the first video I've ever made on YouTube, so hopefully someone watched. It'd be interesting if someone made it all the way through, and leave a comment, because I don't get to talk about this stuff enough, which is why I'm making the video. Don't really know what I want to make going forward. I've got some other videos I've thought about as well. Most of them do not have to do with history. History just happens to be what I was thinking about today. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed.